Howdy, folks. This is Big Sam. A lot of y'all, unfortunately, may have not had a chance to take a real close look at a PU sniper, and in particular, be able to disassemble it to sort of see how this works, because this is a really interesting and novel setup here, how the mount and the scope and the base all interact with each other to work. And it's really an important part of World War II and world history of how the Soviets were able to hobble this mechanism together and produce these in the hundreds of thousands during World War II. So today we're going to take a closer look at exactly how a PU scope mount works. And we're going to disassemble it here and just see exactly what it is going on under the hood, because some of y'all may not have had a chance to see it yet. Okay, so how does this whole system work here with the PU scope? Well, the first thing that's important to note here is that there are three main mechanisms of the PU scope system. We have, number one, the scope itself. Okay, that's kind of an important one. Number two, we have the scope mount here, which is this part, which clamps to the scope. And then number three, which is the base, also known as the Kochetov base. That's the guy who invented it. That is the part that secures the scope mount to the rifle. So we're going to go ahead and first take out the scope mount from the base housing, and we'll see how this whole thing works. Now, the way to do that, the first thing you need to do is you'll see we have this screw right here. Let me zoom in a little bit here. All right, now there's my pointer, my toothpick. So you see I have this massive screw right here. Okay, this is the main securing mechanism to the base. We can see here that it is putting tension up against the scope mount here, and it is putting tension on it to push it up against the base, which is right here, this whole thing back here. So we have the scope mount and then the base here. So the first thing to do, and generally, this one's loose. Generally, you need a flathead screwdriver to take this out. And if you're going to do that, make sure you have the right size bit so you don't really mess this up, is always a good tip. This one's, again, loose, so I can go ahead and unscrew this guy for you here. So the base right here is threaded. I'm going to do my best not to mix up the base and the mount. Sometimes I'll use those terms interchangeably, but they are not interchangeable. They are two different things. All right, so there's our massive scope base screw. As we can see, that's as big as my finger. And we can see it's threaded. Now, we also have these screws here. We'll talk more about these here in a second, but sometimes these really should be securing, again, the scope mount to the base here and providing tension. So you may need to loosen these, and you probably should if your scope is properly aligned, but we'll talk about that here in a little bit. So these two screws, need to make sure these are loose enough to where there's play here. All right, now if there's play, what we can do now is we're going to take the mount and twist it out like that. See how I'm doing with my hand there? And we're going to twist it out like that. So now it's free, so I can twist it out, and then I just pull it off like that. Okay, now we're missing a couple things here, but before we get to that, I want to take a closer look exactly what just happened. So the way this works is we have the main screw here, we have these two secondary screws, and then we have this weird like ball-shaped thing. See that right here? There's this big ball on the side of the scope base. This whole thing is the scope base. Well, likewise, if we look on the other side of the mount, we can see that we have this ball-shaped recess. It's concave right here. And so the way that works is it just sits up on there. It doesn't have to be machined perfectly, but it needs to be enough to where it'll interface pretty well with that. But that's really not all that hard to machine, so it was a pretty novel concept, and that's why the Soviets liked this. It was pretty easy to machine. We'll talk more about that. Okay, so the way the mount, how does the mount secure to the rifle? Okay, so there's a few things going on here. We have two pinholes that we're going to talk about first of all. So pinhole number 1, which is here, there's a pin. Pinhole number 2 here, there's no pin, which we'll see why here in a second. So there's first of all these two pins, and the way that works is the pins are basically press fit into the scope base here, and then the pins will sit inside the pinholes cut into the receiver. That fit into the receiver should be relatively loose. You shouldn't have to like beat that in with a hammer. It should just sort of sit in there. It's not going to wobble a ton, but it's just enough to align the base, the scope base, to the receiver properly. In order to show you that a little bit better, what I'm going to do now is pull out a barreled action that doesn't have the base attached to it. See this guy? Okay, so in order to affix a Kochetov base, which is what this guy here, this is a Kochetov base, to a PU, to a Mosin-Nagant receiver, you need 4 holes in the receiver. Okay, you have your 2 main holes. These guys are going to be threaded. As you can see, these guys are threaded. Okay, that one's kind of hard to see. There we go. And then these 2 smaller holes here are not threaded. These are the pinholes. Okay, that's where the pins just sit in. Now, generally on these, what you're going to see is that these pinholes here on the Izhevsk PU snipers were drilled all the way through. And on the Tulas, these were blind holes where they were not drilled all the way through. And we'll also see that on the earlier PEM style rifles as well. So we can already tell that because these are drilled all the way through, this is probably an Izhevsk, but also note that a lot of ex-sniper conversions, even on Tulas, people generally will just drill all the way through just because it's easier to do that. So if you have a real Tula PU sniper that has the blind holes, it's probably a converted ex-sniper, probably. Okay, so it's pretty simple, right? 4 holes. Also worth noting here, the gap in the back between the pinhole and the first threaded hole is a lot narrower than the gap between the front pinhole and the threaded hole. That's just one of the quirks of a PU mount. See that, if you look at that hole pattern, that just looks weird and not quite right, but that is absolutely correct. You can also see this one is an original Izhevsk that still has the original scope serial number on the rifle here. This one was made in 1944. And this is not a converted one. This is actually the original holes, which is kind of interesting and pretty good. So I can show this as an example for today's video. So if I line this up here, we can see, okay, pinhole, 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 pinhole. And then what about these? Okay, so this is the big screw that threads into the receiver here. Likewise, we have one here. What are these secondary holes, though? Well, let me set this guy aside here, and we'll talk about those secondary holes. Okay, so the secondary holes here, these are for the locking screws, okay? Now, this particular one doesn't have it because, well, sometimes if you're just randomly putting parts together, you need to have the recess here cut out, lined up with where that locking screw would be. And you can see here, the recess in the main screw doesn't line up right here where the locking screw would go. So I would either need to make a new cutout here in the head right here, or what I also could do is just buy a whole set more of these locking screws and find one that fits. So I have several options that I could do there. But another option, which is kind of what we have going on here, is to just not even use those. So there's no locking screws here. Now, remember the locking screws, they are threaded, but it's threaded inside the base. The locking screws do not go into the receiver. They go into the Kochetov scope base, which is what we have here. Okay, so the Soviets liked that design because compared to like the older PE design, which used a similar setup here, the PE just had 6 screws, but they didn't have Loctite, so those screws would come loose. So they switched, and maybe they got, locking screws were not used with Mosins before, but they were widely used in other things. Just to name an example would be if you look at like a Mauser-style rifle, like a Car 98, you'll see like a lot of the screws to affix the receiver to the stock have secondary locking screws. So that was sort of an older style thing to do, but the Soviets just never really got around to doing that with Mosins until the PEM mount, which had locking screws. But again, that's a story for another day. We also notice here that that other pin is missing. Now, this is one of the problems you'll encounter if you have a Mosin where the holes have already been drilled out, like that one we just looked at, but the base is not attached to it. So if I were to go find a base for that rifle that we just looked at and try to attach a base, we would run into an issue because the pinholes in the Kochetov scope base almost never line up properly with the pinholes in the receiver if they haven't already been cut out. Now, if you're like converting an X sniper, you don't have that problem, because what you would do is you would like get a C-clamp or something and clamp the base to the receiver, and then you would just use these as guide holes to drill out the holes inside the receiver, so you wouldn't have that problem. But if you have a scope or a rifle, particularly the most likely example would be a Samco sniper, which is actually what this guy is, where a lot of the rifles were imported. They're real sniper rifles, but they were not imported with the base. A lot of them were. That's the issue you run into. So what do? Well, we could just use one. I just use one pinhole or one pin to line it up with a pinhole, and it works, you know? It seems to work okay. There's a couple other things you can do to remedy this. One other thing we've looked at, we have another rifle we feature here on the channel where the previous owner actually just re-drilled out this hole in the receiver, which works, but I just prefer to set it up this way. There's also some other things you can do as well, but that's kind of going down the rabbit hole for another video. Okay, how do we affix this to the receiver? 2 pinholes, 2 threaded holes in the receiver, and then 2 threaded holes in the base for the locking screws. Okay, it's pretty simple. And we can also talk about the PEM scope mount and do a little bit of a comparison here. This is the older style. I don't want to go too much down a rabbit hole because this is sort of getting out of the scope, but it's interesting to see the lineage of where this came from. This is an older PEM style scope mount, and it's sort of similar. We have the same big holes here that we'd have the threaded holes in the receiver that these big screws would go through. We have threaded locking holes in the base, and we have the pinholes here and here, just like we do on our Kochetov mount. So kind of interesting. And we'll talk about, in a little bit, we'll talk more about why the Soviets went from this design to this design. But now what I want to do is talk about these other things that we sort of punted on earlier. These 2 little screws here. And this goes into the point, how do you actually sight one of these guys in? So a lot of times when you pick up a PU sniper rifle, whether it be real or fake, when you look through the reticle, which is, we're going to see how well this is going to work, folks. When you look through the reticle, you can see this one's pretty well centered. And I apologize, it's not the best view in the world, but it does work. This one's pretty well centered. The reticle is sort of centered horizontally and vertically. A lot of times when you see it, the reticle will be, instead of being in the center, it'll be like shifted over to the left and up to the left, or shifted over to the right and then down or something like that, just all over the place. That's because the easiest thing to do in sighting one of these in is just to adjust the position of the reticle, which you can do, but that's not how these are set up. The way you're actually supposed to do that is if you want to make adjustments or need to make adjustments, instead of adjusting the reticle, you're actually supposed to adjust the whole scope mount to the base. So let's say I need to adjust my scope to the left. So how do I do that? Well, instead of actually moving the reticle to the left, I would actually want to move the whole scope slightly angled towards the left more. So How do you do that? Well, this is one of the pitfalls of this design. It's a little bit of a pain. So if I want to move this left, angle it more like this way, how do I do that? Well, really what you have to do is you actually, and you see someone's already done it on this guy, you actually have to come on here on the scope mount itself. This is the mount, remember? And you have to file down on this surface because this is the surface that interfaces with the scope base here. And then what if you want to go the other way? Well, if you want to go the other way, you basically have to put a shim in here to shim it up against the base like that. And you can see I'm kind of pretending to do that with my finger right here. So if I want to go this way, I would put a shim in there. So that's how you adjust windage. Pretty crude, but again, this is Soviet Union in the 1940s under wartime conditions. It worked. It got the job done. But how do you adjust elevation like this? What if I want to adjust elevation? Well, again, instead of moving the reticle up and down, what you're supposed to do is move this guy up and down. And this is, again, just like this guy, this is where this hinge really comes into play because we can see this hinge here really allows us to get the mount to move freely left to right and up and down. This is an ingenious setup, and it was quite good for its time under the conditions, okay? But how do we move it up and down? Well, this is where these screws come into play. If I want to move the scope up like that, I need to tighten this screw to make it protrude in more and loosen this screw to make it protrude less. Okay, so you can imagine adjusting these two screws could move the mount like here or like here. See that? That's how you're supposed to adjust windage, and you need to do all of that keeping the reticle in the center. That's theoretically the proper way to do this, although a lot of people don't bother doing that because it's sort of a pain, and you'll see especially a lot of the reproduction guns. Generally, the reticle could just be anywhere. If it works, it works, but if it doesn't work for you, then you can always fail over to the old method, which is tried but true and a little bit crude. I mean, how many scope systems out there today where when you have to sight it in, you need to bring a file with you? You gotta love Mosins, folks. I love it. Okay, so that was sort of the pitfall here, but again, it's really not that bad once you get used to it. And if I want to put this guy back in here, all I need to do is get my bolt in here. And I would want to tighten these two screws as well. But remember, tightening these can affect your alignment, which is one of the big reasons that these aren't really returned to zero scopes if you remove the base or the mount from the base here. See, I got it confused already. If you remove the mount from the base, you're going to probably need to re-zero it. So generally speaking, once you go through that whole zeroing process, you don't really want to have to remove this whole system, the mount itself. That would just be a pain because then you have to go through the whole process of tightening it again. So, not good. Now remember, one other thing, this guy, the locking screws I don't have, you can use Loctite instead and just skip the locking screws because remember, Soviets didn't have Loctite in the 1940s or the 30s, which is one of the reasons the PE scope system was a bit of a problem. No Loctite and no provisions for locking screws. So that's really how our setup works here. And if we look up here, the scope itself is secured to the scope mount with these three hole screws here. We have one here and then two here. Very, very simple. Now, remember we talked a little bit earlier about our PEM scope set up, the mount system. Why did the Soviets go from that to this? Well, that's a good question. Let me set this to the side and we'll bring back that mount. Now, this is really similar. This is the older style PEM mount. But notice there was no ball and hinge here. This works it's a dovetail. We can see this dovetail here. Okay, and the way that works is we take our mount, which I have here, and there's a matching dovetail on the back. This one probably spent some time in the ground. This one came from one of my sketchy contacts over in Kiev before the horrible invasion happened. But the way this works again is you just take this guy like here, and you just line him up with a dovetail like that, if you can. And you also have to loosen this screw because it does protrude. Okay, and then it has to fit here on this guy, so you'd have to beat it on here. And it works. It actually can work quite well, but one of the problems with this whole setup, let me tighten this here, is, and then you see this is very tight. Even though this spent some time in the ground, this actually would work on a rifle. Like, this doesn't move at all. In fact, I'm pretty impressed. This is a good design, but the problem is this wasn't a good design for the Soviets, because what's a good design for me may not be a good design for thee, because thee may have different circumstances they're going through than me. What am I talking about? Well, look at the Soviets. The issue they had where they lost millions of rifles after the start of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, including thousands of sniper rifles. And the problem is the Tula factory had stopped production of these sniper rifles, and until then, they were the only people making sniper rifles. So in 1940, in 1941, that whole year, the Soviets lost a ton of rifles, but they weren't producing any new Mosin Nagant sniper rifles in 1941. That's a problem. And of course, the Tula factory, as we know, got evacuated. They moved the whole factory over the Urals to a place where the Nazis weren't going to get to it immediately. So the Ijevsk factory had to figure out, okay, well, how do we go about making a new scope system? Because the problem is, the Ijevsk factory, we are going to have to start making sniper rifles, but we don't really know how to make these. Now, the Ijevsk factory did make these. They made a very small amount of, comparatively a very small amount of PEM sniper rifles in 1942. But some of them, they used Tula scope bases and scope mounts like we see here, because the Ijevsk factory wasn't really set up to be able to produce these, because these dovetails and the fitting here with this pin took very high precision, very high tolerances. So, like, really precise tolerances, I should say, to get this to work right. And the Ijevsk factory was not set up to do that. And so they said, you know what, this is kind of a nightmare. They may have even produced sniper rifles, but they didn't have the bases or the mounts ready for them, so they couldn't even done anything with them. They just have to issue them as regular infantry rifles. So they started conducting trials and experiments and having people doing tests to figure out, how do we make a new scope mounting system that is actually going to work for us, something that we can produce in large numbers quickly without worrying about these tolerance issues. Well, a guy named Kochetov, ding ding Kochetov, came up with this ingenious design, we see here, guys, which was the PU scope setup. Now, he didn't design the PU scope, because remember, the PU scope had already been around earlier, and it was used originally on SVT-40 rifles, but he devised a base and a mounting system to be able to take those PU scopes that they had lying around, because remember, this is a really good design, and they produced a ton of these. These are definitely easier and cheaper to make than the older PEM scopes as well, but they had these, and this is what they decided to standardize on for Mosins going forward. They said, how do we make a mount that we can actually produce for this style of scope? And this is what he came up with. So this ball, this rotating ball here, and then this windage and elevation adjustment system that we have here. Kind of crude by today's standards, but again, this is exactly what the Soviets needed. They didn't need high precision, very, very like the nicest mount system possible. They needed something that they could produce in large numbers quickly with the skill set and the tooling that they had at the time at the Ijevsk factory. Okay? The fact that they were able to come up with this system was amazing, and it worked. And they actually started production of these rifles in the Ijevsk factory around October of 1942, and it's cool because even around that time, in October and November of 1942, the Ijevsk factory actually produced PEM sniper rifles and PU sniper rifles side by side in that 2-month window. That's really interesting. In another video, we'll take a look at an XPEM sniper rifle that was in one of those serial number prefixes. Pretty cool, because again, some Ijev's PUs are in a very limited prefix for 1942, but you can find some PEM sniper rifles in that same prefix window from October and November of 1942. And then this again just took off, and I mean, we even see today in the Ukraine, poor guys are still running around with these PU snipers. Like I said, folks, if it works, it works. These have really stood the test of time. If you get one of these set up properly, these things just work. These are tanks. I mean, the Soviets, you know, even with the inception of the Dragunov, these things didn't go away fully ever. Now, a lot of them got refurbished and set aside and exported to the United States or to other countries in proxy wars, but as we can see, they still have them in their inventory, folks. 80 years later, they're still apprehensive to let these things go because this has stood the test of time, and it's a simple and effective system. So I hope this gives y'all a better idea of exactly how these PU scopes work and how to set one up. If you haven't already, I really hope that you get a chance to take a closer look at one of these in the future, because these are just neat, and these are a really important part of history. So thank you guys for watching. Let me know if y'all got any prayer requests, and we'll see you next time.